We'll just give everyone a minute to let them all finish connecting, and then I suppose we'll just get stuck in. Okay, good evening everybody, and you are very welcome to this evening's webinar. As some of you may notice, I'm not Patrick McWalter, but I hope to be a worthy substitution for him today. Patrick asked me would I host this event, and I have to say I was actually delighted to do so because I have a particular interest in the media and its role in current society. In particular, there is a premise that vital to democracy is the freedom to offend, shock, and disturb. And as we here at LawSoc celebrate our 100 years, it makes us reflect on the 100 years that has passed, what has transpired, and the role the media has actually had to play in that. Consider this: in our very recent history, homosexuality was not just deemed offensive, it was outright criminalized. The prospect of an unwed mother was something to be shamed and institutionalized, which we feel today as we address the fallout and shed light on the crimes of the Magdalene laundries and the mother and baby homes. These acts or prospects, which were once offensive, shocking, and disturbing, are now considered the most basic of human rights. Where would we be today if the people could not voice their outrage, their joy, their heartbreak? Where would we be if no one could see the crimes of the world or the pictures of the survivors of Auschwitz? Being shocked, being offended, and being disturbed is the outward expression of our human morality. It is our voice as a society. I recently read that freedom of the media, which is a foundational pillar of democracy, is a double-edged sword. So in an age of social media and internet, how can we reconcile the freedoms of the media with its more dangerous side through hate speech, incitement of violence, and its potential to incite vigilante justice? The media now has a large influence on how we receive information and maybe on how we form our views as a society. The constitutional provision that justice be done in public has taken on a new meaning in the modern age. It was only 3 years ago that we saw the Chief Justice and the members of the Supreme Court broadcast their judgments on national television. There have been few sentences quoted more often than that of Lord Hewitt, than that Chief Justice of England in the case of Rex and Sussex. Justice must not only be done, but it must also be seen to be done. So almost 100 years ago, I don't think Lord Hewitt could have ever imagined the technological advances that we have seen in the last century. And even nowadays, the court system is sometimes viewed to be complex and a stuffy environment. And however, citizens certainly recognize the outstanding contribution that print and broadcast journalism that contributes to the public's understanding of justice, the legal system, and the issues we're facing today. So I think that's probably a very good moment to introduce our fantastic guest, Mr. Frank Greaney, who has been described as highly effective, listener-friendly, and superb. Frank is a former NUI graduate, having studied corporate law from 2001 to 2004, ultimately graduating with a master's in journalism, with a first-class honours, no less, and has since gone on to hold posts at Galway Bay FM, Dublin's 98 FM, Communicorp, News Talk, and Today FM, and I would say more importantly, Bowtown Craft Beer and Burgers as a student. So before we begin, the last thing I would say to you before, because I'm sure you're sick of hearing from me now, if you want to ask any questions, we're going to be monitoring through the chat. We're going to try and put them to Frank and get this as conversational as possible. So please head over to Slido. The code is LawSoc104, and you should be able to also see that on the screen. So Frank, thank you for joining us. And I hope that was a worthy introduction for you, and I'll leave it over.
It really was, and I really appreciate the plug for Bowtown as well, Matthew. Very much appreciated, and it is a great honor for me to join the Law Society and be a part of the celebrations of such a milestone. You know, a centenary doesn't come around very often, and I'm delighted that I was asked to speak to all of you. I would have rather do it in person for obvious reasons, but we are where we are, and it is great to be a part of this. You know, the Chief Justice, Frank Clark, opened up this webinar. I understand that Helen McEntee is going to be speaking to you next week as well, the Minister for Justice, and that just goes to show the caliber of the Law Society. And I am a very proud, you know, alumnus of NUI Galway, having studied, as Matthew mentioned there, corporate law. And I finished in 2004, as he mentioned, and you know, when I finished my course, I felt a little bit unsure about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. At 16 years of age, I was asked to make a very big decision about what I wanted to do. And, at such a young age to try and figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life. But I always liked business studies, and I really wanted to try out some legal studies. So corporate law for me in NUI Galway, throw a language into the mix there. I studied German as well. Was just a perfect fit for me. I really enjoyed the 3 years that I spent studying it. But by the time I finished at, 21 years of age, I felt that I wanted to do a bit of traveling, wanted to see a bit of the world before I decided to take the next step. And while I was away, I started writing. It was something that I always enjoyed doing. And I had a light bulb moment while I was away. And when I returned, I was adamant that I wanted to be a journalist. And I applied for the master's program in Galway, and I was unsuccessful at my first attempt, with all the will in the world. And I was telling them how passionate I was about becoming a journalist. I had no experience to back that up. And, the places, it was a very competitive course at the time, the huge demand for places. And I was unsuccessful. And I spent the next 12 months working in a bar in Galway, the Dewdrop Inn. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And I started writing the local notes from my hometown of Barna in Galway, not too far outside the city, for the Galway City Tribune. That was my first ever journalism job. And all these years later, I'm very proud to say that I still do it. I find that it's a great way to keep in touch with what's happening in my local community. I'm obviously based in Dublin now for some time, but that was my break. And what that did was it allowed me get a small toe in the door of the journalism world. And I suppose more importantly, from an academic point of view, it allowed me to go back to NUI Galway the following year when they reopened the application process for the master's program. And I was able to tell them that not only do I have the passion to be a journalist, I've now gone and got a little bit of experience. And thankfully, I was successful at the second time of asking. And that was the first experience I had of broadcast journalism. I had always wanted to be a writer. I was more drawn to print. But I stepped into the radio studio in the journalism suite in the Arts Millennium building back in 2008, and I just fell in love with the medium. I fell in love with the immediacy of it, the intimacy of it. There's nothing more exciting than working in a broadcast newsroom when there's a breaking news story. I learned a hell of a lot during my time at NUI Galway. And when I came out the other end of my master's program, it was 2009. It was the height of the recession. The country was on its knees. The journalism industry, like so many others, was struggling. People were losing their jobs. Those that had them were holding on to them for dear life. And I found myself being thrust into this market, and there was no work. Put simply, there was no work out there for me. So I had to become, I suppose, a little bit innovative. And what I did with my last few bob from the Dewdrop Inn was I went out and I bought myself a battered old laptop. I bought myself a microphone that I still have to this day for sentimental purposes, and some editing software. And I went down to the courthouse in Galway because that's what I knew. From my time studying corporate law in Galway, I was familiar with the law side of things, and I felt there was a niche there for a broadcast freelance journalist down the courthouse. So I literally went down there and sat in on cases. Days would go by, weeks would go by, and you might be without a story, and without a story, you're not making any money. But slowly and surely, as I developed a little bit of a reputation, stories did come my way. And I do remember the Central Criminal Court was sitting in Galway many years ago, and there was a rape trial that caught an awful lot of attention, both locally and nationally. And with me being the only broadcast journalist in the courtroom, I did get a lot of work out of it. I was bringing daily updates to stations right across the country. And I do remember, and this was a dreadful case, there was a young woman who was abused from a very young age by her stepfather. And her mother didn't believe her. She brought these allegations to her mother, and she didn't believe her. And her mother stood by this man. And this woman eventually found the strength and bravery to make a complaint to Gardaí. This went to trial. The man was convicted by a jury of his peers. And despite that conviction, this woman's mother still stood by him, still believed him over her own daughter. And I remember sitting there the day at his sentence hearing, and she was delivering a victim impact statement. She got into the box herself to deliver it, and you know, it moved everybody in the courtroom. She was outlining the effect that his, you know, abuse had on her. You know, she felt that not only had she lost the innocence of her childhood that had been taken from her by him, he had also taken her mother. And I remember, you know, on this battered old laptop, bashing out a note as quickly as I could. I wanted to do her statement justice, and I was trying desperately to get every word down. And I stepped outside the courtroom to file. And I remember this woman standing in the corner alone, having left the courtroom. You know, her abuser had been taken away, her mother had left, and she was on her own, and she was bawling her eyes out, and she had nobody there with her. And I just felt a pang of guilt that here I was, you know, trying to benefit from her tragedy. That's how I had looked at it at that point. And I closed my laptop shut, and I went home and I didn't file. And to this day, I mean, at the time I thought I was doing the right thing by her. But to this day, that's one of my biggest regrets, because what I've learned over the years doing what I do is that she wanted her story to be told. Many don't, and that's fine too. But she wanted her abuser to be named and shamed. She wanted his name to be shouted from the rooftops. You know, I could have facilitated her in doing that, and I thought I was doing the right thing by not doing that. And I guess that's why I do. One of the many reasons I do what I do. You know, shortly after that, I moved to Dublin, and I worked on the freelance circuit there for about 5 years before I got a full-time job with 98 FM, a very good local radio station here in Dublin. And I was eventually appointed their crime correspondent in 2013. I did that for 2 years. That was the height of one of the many gangland feuds in Dublin. So I was very busy. My workstation quickly became various crime scenes around the city. And on the back of that then, and I suppose given my background in NUI Galway and my freelance work in the courthouse in Galway, I was appointed the courts correspondent for News Talk and Today FM. And that's a job that I do to this day. I take great pride in it. I have found myself over the years covering some of the most harrowing cases to come before the courts here in Dublin, right across the country, and further afield in the likes of Belfast and Preston. And like I said, it's a challenging job, but it's one I certainly don't think I would be doing if it wasn't for my time at NUI Galway.
Considering that, I mean, as a person, like how do you overcome, I suppose, the emotive impact that some of these cases have? I mean, I suppose, like, as a law student myself and studying criminal law, like some of the cases, like, you read and hear, and then, you know, like, yeah, as a person, you must feel the weight of it. I mean, how do you push through that to know that you're doing the right thing and you're getting it out there? I mean, does it present as an obstacle at times?
It's a brilliant question. You know, a lot of the guys back at the newsroom would call me Blackheart, because they think that I could sit through these things and not show any emotion at all, when that couldn't actually be further from the case. There have been many occasions down through the years I've been covering these cases where I'm almost reduced to tears. You know, it's remarkable the level of violence that human beings can inflict on one another. And what people don't realize is that, you know, in my coverage of these cases and my colleagues on the press bench, you know, we're only bringing the tip of the iceberg to the people, to our listeners, to our readers. You couldn't possibly publish the level of detail that we sit through day in, day out. My mind always wanders to the people who really matter in these proceedings, you know, the people who are left behind in murder cases, the mothers and fathers who have lost loved ones in tragic and violent circumstances, you know, complainants who take to the witness box to give evidence of, you know, the most intimate and personal details of their lives. And indeed, of course, you have to spare a thought for the person sitting in the dock who is entitled to a presumption of innocence throughout these proceedings. So, you know, I'm always humbled but a little bit baffled when people ask me how I am, because at the end of the day, who cares? You know, the people that I've outlined there are the people that really matter. But when you leave court, and some cases are harder to get over than others, like you really do have to learn to try and leave it at the door, because if that bleeds into your personal life, it can be a very difficult job to do. You know, I remember a case many years ago where there was a woman who had lost her husband in a workplace accident, and his company was held criminally liable. And this woman had spoken about a row that she had with her husband the night before, and they went to bed angry and they weren't talking. And he got up in the morning and she said that he used to give her a kiss goodbye on his way to work. And she said that she got a phone call from his workplace to say that there had been an accident. And sadly, he lost his life. And the company that he worked for was convicted, of a criminal offense. And in her victim impact statement, she was talking about the regret that she felt, that she didn't get to say goodbye, and that the last conversation that they had was one in anger. They'd had a row, and she was recalling like when they first moved into their home together and dancing around the kitchen, and how they'll never be able to do that again. And tears were streaming down her face. And I'm not embarrassed to say that I wasn't far off it, and that does really affect you. Listening to all that, you want to do their stories justice. It's really important that you do it justice and that you're professional. And I'd like to think that, when it comes to sharing these people's stories, that I'm very respectful of them.
Is that, I suppose, bearing that weight, is that kind of what made you turn to wanting to write a book?
That's precisely why I wrote a book, Matthew. Opportunities have come to me over the years. Various publishers have knocked on my door looking for me to write about certain cases that I have covered. The Belfast rape trial springs to mind. Other cases have come up down through the years, and I've turned all of them down. And the reason I turned them down was because I felt I would have been doing them for all the wrong reasons. I mean, I've always wanted to write a book. It's been on the bucket list for many years, but I didn't want to just write any book. And I felt that if I was to write a book, I wanted to bring something new to the table. I didn't want to just dredge up all this horror and gore for the sake of flogging books, because that wasn't the most important thing for me. What I saw in the story that I did end up writing about was the potential to set the record straight. And that's a very important responsibility that journalists like me have. And what an incredible opportunity that I was given to do that. The book and the story that I wrote about was about a woman called Patricia O'Connor, a 61-year-old woman, a mother, a grandmother, a wife, and she was bludgeoned to death in her home in Rathfarnham in Dublin in 2017. In June of 2017, a woman out picnicking with her family stumbled upon some human remains. That set in train a chain of motion that would lead me to, I suppose, writing the book. 15 body parts found across the Dublin Mountains in 9 different locations across a 30-kilometre radius. You can imagine the search that took place. And long story short, what happened to Patricia O'Connor was truly awful. She was murdered by a man called Kieran Greaney, her daughter Louise's partner, the father of a number of her grandchildren. He was living under her roof at Rathfarnham, where he killed her, in the bathroom of her home. She owned that home. She was living there with her husband, Gus. They weren't living as man and wife. They had separated some time before that. Kieran Greaney lived there, so too did Louise. Her grandchildren lived there. And Kieran Greaney was ultimately found guilty of murdering her and dismembering her and scatching her remains around the Wicklow Mountains in such a way, having initially buried her in a shallow grave in County Wexford. He returned there, dug her up and scattered those remains across the mountains. And if that wasn't bad enough, when he eventually handed himself in, he came up with a story that depicted Patricia O'Connor as a violent bully, as a monster, as somebody who terrorized everyone in the house, as somebody who physically assaulted and beat his children, her grandchildren, whom she adored. He was ultimately found guilty of her murder. A number of other people, her husband, Gus, her daughter Louise, her granddaughter Stephanie's father, Keith Johnston, a man called Keith Johnston, they are all serving sentences now for their roles in the attempted cover-up afterwards. And what they did after they were arrested is they all spun these lies, these dreadful, horrible lies about Patricia O'Connor. And when her son Richard, Patricia's son Richard, and her siblings were given an opportunity at the sentence hearing to deliver victim impact statements, one theme throughout all of their victim impact statements was how hurtful it was to hear those lies being told about somebody that they really cared about. she was a hardworking woman. You know, she loved her grandchildren. She was a kind person. And through my conversation with her friends that I tracked down, through her family, you know, a very different picture of her was painted for me. And I saw the book Crowded House as an opportunity to set the record straight and to give the likes of her son Richard and her siblings that platform to tell the truth and to tell people about the Patricia O'Connor that they knew and loved. And what an amazing thing to be able to do. And that's one of the brilliant things about being a journalism and working in this space, is that you can do things like that. You're giving people a platform. You're giving survivors of crime, you know, of abuse, of horrendous abuse, you're giving them an opportunity to get up and say, this is what happened to me. This doesn't define me.
When I listen to like the harrowing cases, and even just looking at the catalogue cases you've been involved with, and you mentioned organised crime there just before as well. Have you ever felt at risk or in danger from the work you're actually doing?
Luckily, no, I haven't. I know colleagues of mine who have received threats, you know, threats that have been taken very seriously down through the years. I do recall one occasion where, certainly when I was working the crime beat for 98 FM, as I mentioned, you know, like crime doesn't operate Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And more often than not, I would get a phone call in the middle of the night to say, look, this has happened, and I would need to get to the crime scene as quickly as possible. I remember one source calling me in the middle of the night to tell me that somebody had been shot dead in West Dublin, a location in West Dublin. And I made my way to the scene, and I was there so early that there wasn't even an opportunity, or they hadn't the opportunity to properly conceal the body. The body was there. The scene had been cordoned off, but the body was there for me and all to see, and it was eventually covered up. And I do recall somebody that was at the scene telling me that I could actually get a better look at the surroundings from another location. And this person walked me through a number of alleyways. And as I was walking ahead of this person, I heard a gate close and lock behind me, and it was very clear that I walked myself into a spot of bother with no way out. A number of other people emerged, and I was asked what I was doing there. They clearly knew that I was a member of the press. It was pretty obvious because I'd arrived in a 98 FM branded news van. You know, it was the equivalent of an ice cream truck rocking into an estate. And I did feel quite threatened at that point. And thankfully, one of the Gardaí who had secured the area heard my calls of distress and came and rescued me. But that was the only time that I had put myself in any sort of peril. Sometimes, you know, when you're knocking on doors after these things happen, and you're looking for neighbors that might have heard something, saw something, had some information that would feed into your reportage, sometimes you knock on the wrong door. You know, I've had people that have threatened me off their property by unleashing dogs and things like that. And it was par for the course. I did it for 2 years. You know, it was a difficult beat, but certainly things are a little bit calmer in the criminal courts of justice and a little further down the road in the forecourts where I ply my trade these days.
I can't say I know how I'd want to. I don't know how I'd react in a situation like that, and I'm hoping I won't have to find out either. Some of these cases, is there anyone that really particularly sticks with you? I know just from reading the news, there's certain particular ones that stick with me, but is there anyone that just really, I suppose, kind of latches on a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the cases that I covered in recent years was the case of a teenager who was brutally murdered by 2 other children. I can't identify any of those parties with you here at this webinar because of the Children's Act, which, you know, offers protection to the identities of child offenders and also child victims. Section 252 of the Children Act is in the process of being amended. The Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, who I understand is going to be joining your celebrations next week, has been pushing through legislation to have it changed. Because what Section 252 did was it protects the identities of child victims in court proceedings. And the Court of Appeal ruled last year emphatically that that protection extends to child victims, even in cases where they are deceased, so in homicide cases. Now, the unforeseen consequences that are being corrected as we speak, but the unforeseen consequences of that is that it robbed parents of the opportunity to speak publicly about what happened to their children. And another unforeseen consequence was it actually protected the identity of child killers in circumstances where identifying a child offender could actually identify the child, where there's a familial link, for example. There was a case very recently where a man was convicted of murdering his 12-year-old nephew. And it was an absolutely brutal case. This was a frenzied attack. The violent end that young boy met would really make your skin crawl. That boy's mother came outside court afterwards and spoke to us, and we protected her identity. We had to. And one thing that she said was that it was so tragic to feel like, her boy didn't exist, that the law was constructed in such a way that she felt that she couldn't speak about him. Now, as I said, there is a political will to change that. And where there's a political will, there's always a way. And hopefully, this time next month, we'll be in a position to talk about these cases. But certainly the one that had the most impact on me, Matthew, was that case, covering it day to day and listening to the horrific details of how that teenager met their death. That stuck with me for a very, very long time afterwards, to think that, children could inflict that kind of violence on another child, was just mind-boggling. It really left me scratching my head afterwards. Juries don't have to be convinced of a motive when it comes to these cases. So, the prosecution wouldn't have had to prove one beyond a reasonable doubt. But the really chilling thing about this case is the only motive that I could glean from it, having sat through every day of evidence, was that this teenager was killed simply because the other children wanted to kill somebody. And that is truly chilling.
I think when I was watching this case kind of transpire and just listening to speak to you now, I think I suppose the human being in you wants to react, and I suppose the society in you wants to, want to see the due course of justice that is constitutionally inscribed. I mean, I mentioned in my introduction that there can be a darker side of the media, but how do we reconcile, this need for kind of, telling a person's story, seeing justice being done against, I suppose, what I describe as, the potential for vigilante justice for, I know in situations, and I think it might be in the fact of the actual case that you were just speaking about, where there was people misidentified and attacked. I mean, the media is a seriously powerful thing. I mean, it's definitely at the heart of every democracy and the freedom. But I suppose, is there a way around to kind of reconcile that, to find a fair balance?
Matthew, my heart is soaring listening to that question, because it's a really important one. I don't have an answer for you. What has happened over the years is clearly we've seen a rise in social media journalism. There's a reason people like I and my colleagues on the press bench in courthouses exist, is because we're trained to do what we do. But there are a lot of people that follow these cases that aren't. There are a lot of rules and regulations and laws that we have to abide by in our reportage of these cases. This isn't like Making a Murderer. This isn't like, the O.J. Simpson trial that I'm sure, everyone will be aware of, where you'll see journalists, you watch these true crime docs and you see journalists covering these high profile cases over in the United States. And they're outside after day one, after the prosecution hasn't even called witnesses, no evidence has been called. They've opened their case and they've given the jury an overview of it. And you see journalists coming outside the courthouse screaming, "This man is guilty." To do that here would see me, down in the holding cells very quickly. You simply can't do that. The right in Ireland, the right the right for a person to have a fair trial. There is a presumption of innocence, and the right for a person to have a fair trial, to be tried before a jury of his or her peers, far out trumps the right for a person to have a freedom of speech to say what they like. I'm not entitled, professionally speaking, to have an opinion when a trial is live. Opinions are very, very dangerous in my line of work. All I can do is give a fair, accurate, and balanced account of what was heard in court throughout a day's proceedings. That could be 4 to 5 hours of evidence. I don't have the luxury of talking for 4 to 5 hours about what happened in court. You look at my news reports that will go out in News Talk, Today FM, that will go out in local radio stations through News Talk's network service. I mean, they could be 40, 50 seconds in length. So to sum up hours of evidence in that time is a very difficult skill. I might go on the Pat Kenny show or the Last Word with Matt Cooper on Today FM, and I might get maybe 10 minutes to talk about a case, but it's still not a lot of time. And you are under constant scrutiny. The Belfast rape trial, I covered every single day of that. Back in January of 2018, my editor and I, we had a discussion about the case. We knew that it was coming up. We knew there would be a huge level of interest in it, particularly because of, the people who found themselves in the dock, former Ireland and Ulster rugby players, Paddy Jackson and Stuart Olding, accused of raping a woman at a party in Jackson's house. 2 others facing related charges, all of them acquitted, by the way, but clearly, given, I suppose, the high profile of the defendants, the nature of the allegations, it was very clear that I was going to cover the case in Belfast. My father passed away 2 weeks before it opened, and I recall my news editor contacting me at the time and saying, look, there's absolutely no pressure for you to go to Belfast, we'll get it covered. But I felt it was really, really important to do it. My dad loved what I did for a living. He's one of the main reasons I do it, and I found myself thrown into that media circus, the frenzy that developed around that case. I mean, our plan was to go and take the opening address from the prosecuting barrister, a man called Toby Hedworth, and then stay for the complainant's evidence, maybe return to Dublin and come back if the accused decide to take the stand, and clearly would have been there for closing speeches, deliberations, and the verdicts. But it was very clear from the moment Toby Hedworth outlined his case to the men and women of the jury that I was going nowhere. I lived in a hotel in Belfast for months on end, and I have never, to this day, I've never experienced the same pressure covering a case. The media attention. Every show across News Talk and Today FM was taking daily hits on this case. Off the ball, given, I suppose, the rugby angle, off the ball, we're taking morning hits. It was right through the day. Pat Kenny, I would go in, I was live tweeting throughout the case to add to my already enormous workload. And I recall, I'll tell you a funny story, because I recall going into court one day. It was the latter stages of the trial. And I was in the lift. The courtroom was on the 4th floor at Blagenside, and I was on my own, and the doors were closing. And just before they closed, a big black boot came in and stopped the doors. And a man called Frank O'Donoghue walked into the lift. Frank O'Donoghue was the defense barrister for Stuart Olding, and he had a banana in his hands. And I'll never forget it. It was like a scene from a Quentin Tarantino movie almost, where he turned to me and he said, "You're Frank from News Talk." And I said, "That's right." I said, "You're Frank from the Belfast rape trial, Stuart Olding's barrister." And he said, "That's correct." And he said, "Frank, do you know what my wife and I do every night, last thing at night when we get into bed?" And I was thinking to myself, it's 10 o'clock in the morning here. I don't know where this conversation is going. But what Frank O'Donoghue told me was the last thing he and his wife did when they got into bed at night was go through my Twitter feed, my live tweets from the day in court. Mm. And he left that with me. And I remember just thinking about it, and I asked him, "Do you know what? I don't know. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" And he said, "Oh, no. He said, it's a good thing for now." Ping, The doors of the lift opened and Frank O'Donoghue stepped out. Now, Frank O'Donoghue was paying me a very nice compliment there, but also in an indirect way, what he was doing was he was telling me, look, you know, we're keeping an eye on the media. And for these high profile cases, more often than not, there are lawyers assigned to look at media coverage to make sure that what's going out is a fair, accurate, and a balanced representation of the day's proceedings. Frank O'Donoghue has been very complimentary to my coverage and News Talk's coverage of the trial ever since. Clearly, he had a job to do. You know, one of the greatest successes of my career is getting from one end of the Belfast rape trial to the next without finding myself in front of the judge, because, you know, the consequences for journalists on the press benches in courtrooms like that can be catastrophic. You can bring down a trial, you know, you can find yourself in the back of defamation proceedings. I mean, who wanted to be the person who brought down the Belfast rape trial? And there were applications to discharge the trial because of some of the media coverage, but it did make it across the line. And as I said, you know, the 4 men in the dock were acquitted of all charges.
I suppose that kind of leads it into a nice segue of, I suppose, one of the questions I've got, and something that I'm kind of interested in myself. Do you think the law is actually equipped to deal with the media? I mean, to an extent, it's still somewhat of the Wild West that we're still trying to tame. And I mean, I know there's been substantial changes now with the Defamation Act, but first of all, is the Defamation Act severe enough? I mean, it was still, for a long time, it was considered, you know, a rich man's luxury.
Yeah, and I know the Chief Justice, Frank Clark, is very passionate about making the courts more accessible to people during his tenure as Chief Justice. And also he has tried to tackle the scourge of, you know, social media journalists. You know, not long ago, he put a practice direction in place whereby, you know, he was essentially banning members of the public from using, you know, social media platforms in the public gallery. And he said that only bona fide members of the media like myself were allowed to do that. You know, there's another case that springs to mind where this was a real problem, where, you know, a number of people were brought before Dublin Circuit Criminal Court, accused of falsely imprisoning the former Taoiseach, or the former Taoiseach rather, Joan Burton, and this was at a water charge protest in Jobestown in Dublin many years ago. False imprisonment is a very, very serious
I remember
charge.
watching that actually live happen. That was intense, that protest.
It really was, and look, the charges were eventually dropped and struck out, and those people that came before the courts were not convicted of any wrongdoing. But you had an absolutely farcical situation where people in the dock, including a TD, were actually tweeting about what was happening in the court. You know, that's a huge problem, and I know the Chief Justice has tried to tackle it, but, you know, how do you police these things? I mean, enforcement is absolutely crucial. You do have a case before the courts now, and I was actually covering the latest update in this case earlier this week, where 10 people have actually appeared in court charged in connection with publishing the identities of a number of child killers in relation to a case that you and I touched on earlier, Matthew. So it is a criminal offence, you know, and unless you see enforcement, unless you see it being policed, it's hard to see how it will really deter people. And it can be so dangerous. But juries are always told, you know, to ignore social media, to ignore media coverage in general, because it can be prejudicial. But I think, you know, and you look at separately, you look at journalists that are covering the likes of the pandemic. And I think now more than ever, people are starting to realize the importance of the mainstream media, people who are trained to do the job that I do, people who are impartial, people who will just give you the facts. I mean, we should be listening to those types of people. It's certainly a problem. It does feel like the Wild West at times online. It can have catastrophic consequences, as I mentioned, when it comes to criminal proceedings. How we tackle it, you know, your guess is as good as mine. But we are starting to see the state authorities taking it very seriously. We are starting to see prosecutions taking place.
Yeah, I mean, no one, I don't think, Ash, when we look at how the law has progressed in 100 years, I mean, there's no way you could have foreseen this, I suppose, the day we live in today. And the one thing that kind of, it pops into my mind is social media has exploded. And social media, it's a weapon, it's a weapon of propaganda, Adam, and there's no ways around it. And where I find my issues, where I feel that really conflicts with the law is, and where there's kind of maybe even an overhaul needed, that the law wasn't built to react to this kind of presence, which is why I suppose the need of current takers and actually react. But now when I consider something in particular, and I'm going to use the colloquial term here, so you'll have to excuse me, but pedo hunters online, people trapping up people. Now, on one hand, you can see the benefit that these people probably are guilty on one hand, but from my knowledge of the law, you're setting them up to basically not be able to charge them. Second of all, and again, if we go back to, I suppose, vigilante justice, I mean, every week, multiple times a week, you're seeing innocent people and guilty people, like, kicked quite violently on the street. And you can look at that then in conjunction with, I suppose, some of the cyberbullying. I mean, is the law equipped to deal with this, or is it something that really drastically needs to be addressed? In other words, like, I suppose, to tackle it and keep society as a society?
I think the real problem here is the anonymity that some people who use these platforms are afforded. Now, I know, some of the big tech companies that facilitate these platforms are working, they do work closely when there are issues with the authorities when it comes to, identifying users. It is a public platform, and, many would argue and criticize some of, the likes of Twitter for perhaps not regulating it as best they should. But you see Twitter when it comes to the end of Donald Trump's tenure, where they're qualifying all of his remarks, misinformation about COVID-19 and the pandemic. I mean, they're flagging those as well. So we're starting to see that happen. I don't think the sole responsibility is on our lawmakers or, our courts to solve this problem. It really is, it has to be like a coming together of all the vested interests, and people need to take personal responsibility as well. You take the likes of the Belfast rape trial, where I'm live tweeting throughout the day, hundreds of updates throughout the day. And on the back of that is commentary around the case, people having very strong opinions. I can't be seen to police that, because that's a very dangerous thing to do as well, because you're essentially becoming a mediator, and that shouldn't be my responsibility. We're focusing on the dark side of these platforms as well. I mean, when it comes to my type of work, you see that the good that they can achieve as well. Very recently, only last month, I covered a really horrific case of abuse. A man called John McLean, who is now serving a sentence for decades of abuse as a teacher at Terranure College in Dublin. He was a rugby coach there. He abused his position to sexually assault 23 young boys. It took decades for them to find the strength to come forward. Things like social media. One person came forward in 2016, Matthew, and then it snowballed. And, this man's story was being told online, and more people come forward. And, and you're talking about, you mentioned Lord Gordon at the start of the piece, that famous line almost 100 years ago about, and it's in our constitution, whereby justice has to be administered in public, but it also has to be seen to be administered in public. Not everybody can get into the courtroom, and I suppose the legacy of Lord Hewart's words is that my job exists. I'm and my colleagues, we're the eyes and ears of the Irish public who are entitled to be in the courtroom but can't be there. And we can use not just the microphone, but also the platforms that were offered on social media to bring updates to people. I think it's a very positive thing in the right hands, but like anything else, it can be a very dangerous tool in the wrong hands.
I think that's a very fantastic point, and it's definitely stuff that we really do need to really think about, and especially as the next generators of writers, journalists, and lawyers start to guess, this is the time now when to think about it. So we are coming up in the hour, so if you don't mind, I have 3 questions here that we're just going to fire away with you from people in our audience. Do the courts facilitate you as a journalist with facilities or information about cases, or is it a big giant wall of silence? The Chinese wall, they call
it. Was it a journalist that sent that question in by any chance? It's a very good one. And one of the most difficult things about my job is the lack of access that we get to documentation, legal papers, exhibits, things like that. Yes, the media is facilitated in court proceedings, but we don't get any assistance when it comes to things like that. You take some of the white collar crimes that I've covered down through the years, you know, the Anglo trials, banking trials that are document heavy. They go on for months on end, thousands and thousands of documents that we don't have access to. You know, practitioners will have screens, jurors will have screens where these will be flashed up in front of them. And myself and my colleagues are on a wooden pew craning over a barrister's neck to see if we can get a glimpse of some of the figures that they're talking about. You know, we now have a situation where judgments are being delivered. Certainly a lot of civil judgments are being delivered electronically. And that's fantastic, you know, but traditionally when they're handed down in court, sometimes one judgment, a physical hard copy judgment, is made available to the press. There might be 10 journalists down there. I recall like a very big judgment coming in the Supreme Court in relation to Angela Cairns, and this was about absolute privilege on the floor of the Dáil and in Dáil committees. And I was asked, the judgment dropped and it was delivered, and this was a lengthy, complex judgment. And a handful of copies were made available to the press. There was a huge media interest in it. I wasn't lucky enough to get a copy. I had to go down to the law library, beg for a copy to be printed off for me. I was on hold for Pat Kenny's show at the time. It was hot in my hands when I eventually went live on air with Pat Kenny to tell him the update in the case. And I'm literally flicking through a judgment. Surely in this day and age, that shouldn't happen. The facilities that are on offer in the criminal courts of justice, which is a relatively new building, and a huge amount of taxpayers' money was put into it. And, you know, we don't even have access to Wi-Fi. We have no windows in our media room. And you compare that with other jurisdictions, because I think, like, over the years, I've just come to accept that that's the way it is. And in fairness to the Court Service of Ireland, they are getting better. But when you've experienced cases in other jurisdictions and you see how they do it in Belfast and you see how they do it in Preston, I was over there covering an assault trial, Sean Cox, who was assaulted outside Anfield and suffered catastrophic injuries as a result of it. And we're being handed printed speeches, and TVs are rolled out of CCTV evidence, and we're given things like power sockets. I know these all might seem like trivial things, but very important things when you're trying to cover a case and do it effectively. And, you know, if you mishear something that's been read out from a document, you can find yourself getting in all sorts of trouble. So I think there is a lot of room to improve how the media is facilitated.
Yeah, I think, well, as COVID has really highlighted, necessity is the mother of all invention. And when we look at last summer, the expansion and powers of remote hearings, you know, the court has no choice anymore but to kind of modernize. And I know there's been significant attempts to do that through the e-court system and different things like that, which is highly expensive from what I understand. So that might need to be addressed as well. But as technology grows, you know, we need to adapt and we need to react. And I think COVID definitely demonstrated that. We were very much caught unawares. Like, I think a full shutdown of the judicial system is probably unacceptable under any circumstances. So
yeah,
I think,
look, it is great. You mentioned it. Sorry to cut across you, Matthew, but you did mention something, and I think the Chief Justice as well is a lot more conscious of these things. You know, we saw it was a historic moment in the Supreme Court when he allowed TV cameras in there. Now, I don't think we'll ever see ourselves in, you know, OJ territory where these become like media events. They become almost like entertainment, because I think that's too far down the other end. But certainly, I think these things need to be far more accessible to the media.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. So I have two questions left to ask you, but I'm going to kind of combine them into one. I think they're quite similar. So you spoke a bit at the start about, you got into journalism with your law degree. So if you were to turn around now to your younger self, knowing that this is where you were going to end up, what would you tell yourself to do to get more involved? And is there a go-to book that you would slap yourself over the head with, I suppose, and say, hold on to this?
Look, if I could go back in time and have a chat with my first year corporate law self, if I was to tell myself back in '01 that I would be doing what I do now for a living, just the very idea of it would have blown my mind. It's incredible to think that I walked out of NUI Galway in '04 with this amazing degree in my back pocket. There were times when I was studying corporate law where I was sitting in lecture rooms and I felt a bit lost, and I wondered if I'd made the right decision. And I decided not to pursue the traditional route that people might get into corporate law for, to become a solicitor or a barrister, or maybe to focus a bit more on the commerce side of things. But isn't it incredible that piece of paper, and what an amazing piece of paper to have in my back pocket, that opened so many doors for me. And that gave me an incredible grounding, to go back and do that master's in journalism, and then to find the bravery to go into a courtroom, because it's not easy. And there are a lot of experienced journalists that absolutely hate going into courtrooms to cover these kinds of cases, because there are so many pitfalls. It's like a stroll through a minefield at times. There are rules, there are regulations, there are laws that you have to be familiar with. I mean, one of the best things that I got from looking at my career now, from my time in NUI Galway as a corporate law student, was I learned the lingo. One of the most difficult things for somebody who isn't initiated in legal jargon and legal speak is that it can be very easy to get lost in proceedings when you don't really know what they're talking about. And I always felt it was really important to have an understanding of the law before I could turn that into something user-friendly and layman-like. I like to think that my reportage on shows like the Pat Kenny Show and The Last Word with Matt Cooper are conversational in nature, and I can feel confident in doing that because I understand the law. Offences will come onto my desk that I haven't heard of before, but because of my grounding and my studies in NUI Galway, studying something like legal research and legal methods and research has stood to me so much over the years, because I know what I'm looking for. I know how to look for it. And I thank the likes of Larry Donnelly for his guidance in that particular area. It's a very tough beat. And the funny thing is, there is no course. You're not going to go and do an undergrad in court reporting. And in my master's program, it wasn't touched on either. We would have done a little bit of media law. We would have learned about defamation and things like that. But there isn't actually, as far as I can see, in any of the journalism schools, there isn't that vehicle. There isn't a module to teach court reporting, and it is one of the most important areas of journalism, if you ask me. How will the future of journalism look? I mean, I'm not going to be around forever. There are some incredible people working in this area, the likes of Orla O'Donnell, at RTE, Vivian Traynor, RTE. Deborah Naylor, Virgin Media News. There are some incredible people like working for agencies in the courts that do a fantastic job, that know their trade so well. But you just worry about, what's coming up behind us. You couldn't possibly expect every journalism student to do a 3-year degree in corporate law to get a good grounding for what we do. So perhaps looking forward, who knows, NUI Galway might blend those two worlds together, the worlds of law and journalism, and perhaps there would be a module, there would be that facility, and who knows what the future holds. For me, I live every day as it comes, but wouldn't it be great to see myself walking down the corridors of NUI Galway again, and perhaps having some sort of an input in that training? That would be pretty special.
I can probably promise you that there's someone in the room here today that have their eyes firmly set on your position, so you might have to watch out in that regards. And I suppose, like, my aspirations is very much lies in white collar and regulatory crime. So you can look over my shoulder in the future if you find yourself stuck. I think that's going to bring us to a close. This was absolutely fantastic, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, and hopefully Frank did as well. I definitely owe Patrick McWalter a big thank you for giving me the reins on this. I mean, what himself and Niamh have done in the planning of this event has actually just been phenomenal. I mean, I'm kind of a bit disappointed I can't really take any credit for it. But it was absolutely brilliant. And as Frank mentioned earlier on, Helen McAtee is going to be joining us next week. So please keep an eye out for the press release on our International Women's Day event. And that will be released on Monday. So I think that'll do us. And let's see, and we hope you're all coming to the Law Ball tomorrow because it's the only day out we're getting. Okay, thank you, everybody.